Is there a limit to how much debt a country like the U.S. can take on? What happens to our economy, to interest rates, if that debt just keeps growing? And could a country with the world's reserve currency actually go broke? These aren't just questions for economists in ivory towers. The answers will impact every single one of us. Right now, there are two main camps. Some people think there's no real limit, especially for the U.S., because the central bank can always print more money to pay the bills. Others see these massive debt levels and think a huge crisis is just around the corner, but they can't quite say when or how it will hit. The author says, debt is just one piece of the puzzle. There are 4 other huge forces at play: the level of political conflict within a country, the conflict between countries, major acts of nature like pandemics, and game-changing new technologies. All 5 of these forces weave together to create periods of peace and prosperity, followed by periods of depression and conflict. So, how does this giant debt machine actually operate? The author dedicates to breaking it down. He doesn't just jump into the deep end. He starts with a very simple, easy-to-grasp model of how a debt cycle works. Think of it as the 101 level course. Once you got that down, he adds more layers, building it into a complete mechanical model. He wants you to see the cause and effect relationships, the gears turning behind the scenes. He even gets into the math behind it all. He lays out the actual equations that he believes govern these cycles, which helps him project what is likely to happen next. The whole point here is to show that this isn't random. It's a predictable process, a machine with parts that work in a certain way. What happens when you have massive debt, high levels of political division at home, and rising tensions with other global powers all at the same time? We need to understand these timeless and universal cycles because they are happening again, right now. The big debt cycle in a tiny nutshell. Debt. How does it work? And why does it always seem to lead to these massive, earth-shaking crises? The authors see it as a machine, a sort of perpetual motion machine, and if you understand its basic mechanics, you can understand why things happen the way they do. The main fuel for this machine is credit. When credit is easy to get, people and companies borrow, they spend, and the economy booms. Everyone's happy. But all that credit creates debt, and that debt eventually has to be paid back, which sucks money out of the economy and causes a downturn. That's the cycle, plain and simple. We're all familiar with the short-term debt cycle. It's the regular business cycle we see on the news, lasting maybe 6 years or so. The economy gets slow, so the central bank cuts interest rates, credit gets cheap, things boom, inflation picks up, and then the bank raises rates to cool it all down. Rinse and repeat. But here's the part that often gets missed. These short-term cycles add up. With each boom, we tend to take on more debt than the last time. Over decades, this creates a big debt cycle. You go from a healthy situation where debt fuels real growth to a dangerous one where the debt pile is so huge it can't possibly be paid back. The book walks us through the typical progression of this big debt cycle in 5 stages. Think of it like the life cycle of a financial system. It starts with the sound money stage. This is the healthy beginning. Debt is low, money is hard, meaning it holds its value, and borrowing is used for productive things that generate more than enough income to pay it back. Everyone is still a bit cautious from the memory of the last big bust. But good times lead to complacency, which brings us to stage 2, the debt bubble. Money becomes cheap and easy. People start borrowing not just for productive investments, but to speculate. You see amazing new inventions and transformative technologies that everyone throws money at. Asset prices get detached from reality. As the author notes, there's always a popular meme that just about everyone believes, and it gets priced into the market right before it turns out to be wrong. That leads inevitably to stage 3, the top. The bubble pops. It's usually a simple combination of the central bank tightening credit and the debt growth just becoming impossible to sustain. The party's over. This kicks off the most painful part of the process, stage 4, the deleveraging. This is where the system is forced to shed its debt. It's a brutal, self-reinforcing contraction. People sell assets, which pushes prices down, which causes more panic and more selling. This is when you can get a debt-death spiral. The government tries to step in, but its own finances are a mess. And all of this pain is what finally leads to stage 5. The big debt crisis recedes. An equilibrium is finally reached, but only after a massive reduction in the debt burden. To get here, the system has to be reset. This often requires a period of painfully high interest rates to restore faith and convince people to be lenders again. How the government's toolkit changes as this cycle progresses. The author identifies different phases of monetary policy. They start with simple tools, like adjusting interest rates. But when rates hit 0 and that stops working, they have to get creative. They move to debt monetization or quantitative easing, what we saw after 2008. When that's not enough, they move to the next phase, coordinating with the government to get money directly into the hands of the people, like the stimulus checks we saw in 2020. Each phase is a sign that the system is under more and more stress. So, what's the bottom line here? The book leaves us with a few key observations. First, these big debt crises are inevitable. They've happened over and over throughout history. Second, they can be managed. The author talks about a beautiful deleveraging, where policymakers skillfully balance the painful debt restructurings with just the right amount of money printing to keep the economy from collapsing. And finally, for those who understand how this machine works, these crises aren't just a time of risk. They're also a time of incredible opportunity. The mechanics in words and concepts. Forget the complicated supply and demand curves from your Econ 101 textbook. The author offers a much simpler and, frankly, more intuitive formula. Price equals the total amount of money spent divided by the total quantity of things sold. P equals dollars per Q. That's it. If you want to know why the price of something is going up, you just have to figure out if people are spending more money on it or if there's less of it to buy. This framework forces you to look at the real drivers. Who are the big buyers and sellers? And what are their motivations? It's about the why behind the transaction. Within this machine, you have a few key parts. You have goods and services, obviously, but then you have money and credit. Money settles a deal. You hand over cash for a coffee. The transaction is over. Credit is different. It's a promise to pay later. It creates buying power out of thin air, which is why it's the main driver of the economic cycle. It pulls future spending into the present, but it also creates debt, an obligation that will drag on future spending. One person's debt is always another person's asset. This brings us to the key players, the characters driving this whole story. You've got your borrower-debtors and your lender-creditors. These two groups are in a constant tug-of-war. Borrowers want low interest rates. Lenders need high enough rates to make it worth their while. In the middle, you have the banks, who are just trying to make a profit on that spread. Then you have the central government, which tends to borrow and spend to keep people happy, and the central bank, which acts as the heart of the system, trying to keep things in balance. The problem is, everyone is biased toward stimulation. Pushing the economy up is fun. Paying the bills later is not. This natural human bias is what creates the cycles. There are two you need to know about. There's the short-term debt cycle, which usually lasts about 6 years or so. This is your classic business cycle: recession, recovery, boom, and then a tightening that leads to the next recession. But these smaller cycles add up over decades into the long-term debt cycle, or what the book calls the big debt cycle. This is where debt from all the previous booms accumulates until it becomes a massive, unmanageable weight on the entire economy. When that happens, when the debt load is just too big, you get a crisis. And policymakers have 4 ways to deal with it: austerity, spending less, defaults, printing money, or transferring wealth from the rich to the poor. The book argues that the most common mistake is to rely only on austerity, because cutting spending just kills incomes and makes the problem worse. The best path forward is something they call a beautiful deleveraging. This is the key to landing the plane safely. It's a carefully managed process where you balance the deflationary pain of restructuring debts with the inflationary stimulus of the central bank printing money. If you get that mix right, you can reduce the debt burden over time without completely wrecking the economy. It's the artful, necessary end to one big debt cycle, and the messy, turbulent beginning of the next. The mechanics in numbers and equations. What it means for a country's debt to be unsustainable. Think of it like your own finances. If more money is going out than coming in, you're in trouble. You can dip into your savings for a while, or you can borrow more on your credit cards. But eventually, you either run out of savings or max out your cards. The author says that for a country, this is when a debt failure happens. He compares it to the flow of blood in a body. You need income to be higher than your spending, or at least have debt that helps your income grow even faster. When debt grows faster than income, it's like plaque building up in the arteries, because more and more of your income just goes to paying off interest, squeezing out everything else. To see if a country is heading for this kind of trouble, the author watches 4 key things. First, how much debt does the country have compared to its income? In this case, its tax revenue? Second, how much of that income is eaten up by debt payments each year? Third, what are the interest rates compared to how fast the country's economy is growing? And fourth, how much does the country have in savings or reserves to cover its bills? Keep an eye on these four ratios, he argues, and you can see a crisis coming. Now, the author then lays out the actual math for this. But we don't need to get lost in the formulas. The big idea is that you can actually project where a country's debt is heading. It really boils down to three things: a country's spending habits, the interest rate on its existing debt, and how fast its revenue is growing. One of the most important rules of thumb here is what happens when interest rates are higher than the country's growth rate. If interest rates and income growth are the same, and the government isn't overspending, then the debt level stays stable. But if interest rates are even just 2% higher than growth, a country with a lot of debt could see that debt increase by 50% over 20 years. That's how things can get out of control. As of his writing, the U.S. government's debt is about 580% of its annual tax revenue, and it's projected to spend about 12% more than it brings in, not even counting interest. Put that all together, and the U.S. is on a path to see its debt climb from 580% to around 700% of its income over the next decade. That means an even bigger chunk of our taxes will go just to paying interest. He then shows what happens if interest rates rise faster than our economy grows. Imagine your credit card has a 20% interest rate, but your salary only goes up by 3% a year. You know that debt is going to balloon. The author applies this to the country, showing that the higher the starting debt, the faster it spirals upward when interest rates outpace growth. This leads to what he calls a death spiral. It's a classic trap. A country needs to sell bonds to fund itself. But if investors get nervous about the amount of debt, they might start selling those bonds. To attract new buyers, the government has to offer higher interest rates. But those higher rates make the original debt problem even worse, which scares off even more investors. It becomes a vicious cycle of rising rates and rising panic. So, how does a country get out of this spiral? There are really only four ways: cut spending, austerity, default on the debt, have the central bank print money to buy the debt, or massively raise taxes. He notes that, historically, when the debt is in a country's own currency, leaders will unfailingly choose to have the central bank print the money. Let's say the U.S. government needs to issue trillions in new debt, but private investors are getting wary and don't want to buy it at the current low interest rates. Rather than letting rates skyrocket and trigger that death spiral, the Federal Reserve can step in. The central bank prints money by creating new reserves/cash and gives private players that money in exchange for the bonds. This is often called monetizing the debt. In his example, the Fed's intervention keeps interest rates stable, but it causes the money supply to balloon. And when you create a lot more of a currency, its value tends to go down. This can lead to a sell-off of the currency and, as we all know, higher inflation at home. The very act of saving the government from a debt crisis ends up devaluing the money in every citizen's pocket. So, what would it actually take to get the U.S. debt situation stabilized? The author runs the numbers. To keep debt from growing relative to our national income, policymakers would have to pull some big levers. For instance, they'd need to force nominal interest rates down to about 1%. Or they could let inflation run higher, around 4.5% for a decade, so the debt gets smaller in real terms. The other options are just as tough, cutting 12% from government spending or raising tax revenue by 11%. None of these paths are easy or likely to be used alone. The real solution, he suggests, would have to be a careful and balanced mix of all of them. The archetypical sequence. How does a country go broke? It rarely happens overnight. It's more like a slow-moving train wreck that follows a predictable pattern. The author has studied dozens of these crises over the last century and has mapped out an archetypical sequence, a playbook for how these things unfold. First, to really get it, you have to understand the two different kinds of money a country can have. This is a crucial starting point. On one hand, you have hard money. Think of the old gold standard where every dollar was backed by a physical chunk of gold. In these systems, the government has promised to deliver something it can't just print. When a crisis hits, it's sudden and violent. The government breaks its promise, and the value of its money and debt collapses almost instantly. It's like a dam breaking. On the other hand, you have the system we live in today, fiat money. The U.S. dollar isn't backed by gold. Its value is based on the faith we have in the government and the central bank. When a country with fiat money gets into too much debt, the crisis unfolds more slowly. The government can always print more money to pay its bills. So instead of a sudden dam break, it's more like a slow, gradual leak that erodes the value of your money over time. Countries tend to swing back and forth between these two systems over long periods because the extremes of one eventually become unbearable, forcing a switch to the other. With that backdrop, the book lays out the 9 stages of the final crisis. This is the real playbook. Stages 1 and 2, debt accumulation. First, the private sector, people and companies, loads up on debt. Then a crisis hits, and the government steps in to bail everyone out, taking all that private debt onto its own books. Now the government itself is buried in debt. This leads to stages 3 and 4, the squeeze. The government tries to borrow more money, but investors start getting nervous. There aren't enough buyers for the debt being sold. It's a classic supply and demand problem. As a result, you see interest rates start to climb and the value of the country's currency begins to fall. This is the market sending up a huge flare, a big red flag, as the author puts it, warning that serious trouble is ahead. Now we enter stage 5. The central bank steps in. Because rising interest rates are strangling the economy, the central bank has to do something. So it starts printing money, what we now call quantitative easing, or QE, and uses it to buy up government bonds. This is an attempt to artificially hold interest rates down and keep credit flowing. But this often leads directly to the most dangerous part of the cycle. Stage 6, the central bank death spiral. If investors keep selling the country's debt, interest rates will keep trying to push higher. The central bank can get caught in a trap where the interest it's paying out is more than the interest it's earning on all those bonds it bought. It starts losing money. To cover its losses, it has to print even more money. This devalues the currency further, which makes investors sell even more aggressively, which pushes rates even higher. It's a vicious, self-reinforcing spiral that signals the central bank itself is going broke. Once the spiral is in full motion, the end game begins. In Stage 7, the country is forced into what the author calls a beautiful deleveraging. This is a delicate balancing act. You have to mix the deflationary pain of restructuring debts with the inflationary relief of printing money. The goal is to reduce the debt burden without causing either a catastrophic depression or runaway hyperinflation. This is also when governments get desperate, leading to Stage 8, extraordinary policies. Sudden, steep tax hikes and capital controls that make it nearly impossible to move your money out of the country. Finally, all of this pain leads to Stage 9, the return to equilibrium. One way or another, the crushing debt load is brought back in line with what the country can actually afford. This last step is often the most brutal. It typically requires a period of very tight money and painfully high real interest rates. It's the necessary evil to restore faith in the currency, reward savers, and penalize reckless borrowing. It cleans the slate, and only then can a new, healthier economic cycle begin. The severity of this whole process really depends on two things. First, is your debt in your own currency? If it is, like for the U.S., you have more control and can manage the process through money printing. If it's in a foreign currency you can't print, the crisis is much, much uglier. Second, having the world's reserve currency is a massive advantage. It means the whole world has a built-in demand for your dollars and your bonds, which allows you to get away with more borrowing for longer. But, he warns, history shows that countries with this privilege almost always abuse it, which can make the eventual loss of that status even more painful. The private sector and central government debt crisis, stages 1 to 4. The author pulls out his charts from 35 historical crises to show us exactly how the first 4 stages of a debt meltdown typically unfold. It's a bit technical, but it's fascinating because you can see the patterns develop step by step. Stage 1 is the slow, quiet beginning. The country gets deep in debt. This isn't something that happens overnight. For years, the government runs deficits, meaning it spends more than it collects in taxes. At the same time, the private sector, that's regular people and companies, is also borrowing heavily. A key part of this stage is that the country starts relying on foreigners to pay its bills. It's buying more from the world than it's selling, and the government is spending more than it has. To cover both of these gaps, it has to borrow money from abroad. This works fine for a while, but it creates a huge hidden vulnerability. The country's financial health is now dependent on the goodwill of foreign lenders. This leads directly to Stage 2. The private sector has its own debt crisis, and the government is forced to step in. This is the turning point. The private sector, which has been borrowing like there's no tomorrow, finally hits a wall. People can't pay their mortgages, or companies can't pay their loans. To stop the whole economy from collapsing, the government has no choice but to ride to the rescue. It starts borrowing massive amounts of money to bail out banks and support the system. The author points out a classic warning sign here. You see private debt levels start to fall, but government debt absolutely skyrockets. All that private debt is essentially being moved onto the public's balance sheet. The government's financial situation goes from a little stretched to extremely dangerous very quickly. Now that the government has taken on all this new debt, we hit stage 3. The government itself experiences a debt squeeze. Suddenly, the people who were lending the government money start to get nervous. They look at the soaring debt and wonder if they're ever going to get paid back. So, the free market demand for the country's bonds starts to dry up. The government needs to sell bonds to keep the lights on, but there aren't enough buyers. This is when you start to see some shady accounting. The book mentions that governments will resort to all sorts of creative financing tricks to hide the problem. They might use off-the-books entities to borrow, or they might pressure their own domestic banks and pension funds to buy the government bonds that no one else wants. They're trying to paper over a huge crack that's forming in the foundation. This is where things get really dicey, and we enter stage 4. The selling of government debt triggers a full-blown crisis. This is the big one, the main event. It starts with what the author calls a doom loop. The few investors who are still willing to lend demand much higher interest rates. But those higher rates make the government's debt problem even worse, which just scares off more investors. It becomes a self-reinforcing death spiral. The country's central bank then tries to make a stand. It will try to defend the currency by raising interest rates even higher and by selling off its own savings, its foreign reserves. But this defense almost always fails. The super high interest rates crush the already weak economy, and the central bank eventually runs out of reserves to sell. When everyone sees the defense is failing, the panic becomes a stampede for the exits. The author calls this capital flight, and it's not just big, faceless foreign investors. It's everyone. Domestic companies start keeping their money offshore. Wealthy citizens move their savings abroad to protect them. Even regular people start buying up physical goods or foreign currency, trying to get out of the local currency before it collapses. It's a complete loss of faith, and it's what turns a debt problem into a catastrophic currency collapse. The crisis spills over to the central bank, stages 5 to 6. All right, so the crisis is in full swing. The government can't pay its bills, and the market is in a doom loop. What happens next? The problem lands squarely on the central bank's doorstep. The Federal Reserve, or its equivalent in other countries, is forced to get its hands dirty. Stage 5. The central bank steps in. The government is maxed out on its credit cards, and no one will lend to it anymore, but it still has bills to pay. So it turns to its last resort, the central bank. At this point, the central bank is forced to act. This is when you hear the phrase quantitative easing, which is really just a fancy term for firing up the money printer. The central bank creates new money out of thin air to buy up the government's bonds, keeping the government afloat. Now, the author flags this as an early-stage red flag. It's a warning sign, and there are two key things to watch for. First, you see the central bank's balance sheet swell as it buys more and more government debt. Second, you see the government itself start to issue shorter-term debt because investors are getting nervous and don't want to lock their money up for the long haul. This is the calm before the storm, the temporary fix that sets up a much bigger problem. And that bigger problem is stage 6, the central bank's unraveling. This is where things get really dicey, and it's the heart of this part of the crisis. The central bank has bought all these government bonds that pay a low interest rate. But to fight the growing instability, it might need to raise the interest rates it pays out. When that happens, the bank finds itself in an impossible situation. It's paying out more in interest than it's earning on its assets. It starts losing massive amounts of money. This is what triggers the death spiral. It's a vicious, self-reinforcing cycle. The central bank's losses force it to print even more money just to cover its own holes. That new money flooding the system makes the currency weaker. When investors see this, they panic and start selling the currency and the country's debt. That selling pressure forces interest rates even higher, which in turn creates even bigger losses for the central bank. And the spiral accelerates. The book lays out a few clear hallmarks of this stage. First, the central bank itself starts reporting huge losses and can even have a negative net worth. Think about that. The institution that backs the money is broke. Second, it gets trapped into what's called forced monetization. It has to keep printing money, even though everyone knows it's making the currency crisis worse. Third, you see a telling shift in the bank's assets. It starts selling its hard assets, like gold and foreign currency reserves, to defend its own currency, while its books fill up with soft assets, which are basically IOUs from its own struggling government. It's trading real value for paper promises. And finally, all of this means the central bank's ability to defend the currency is collapsing. It's running out of ammo, and a full-blown currency crisis becomes almost inevitable. This is the moment the lender of last resort finds itself in need of a rescue that will never come. This is the big red flag that signals the end game is approaching. The central bank is now trapped between two terrible choices: keep policy easy enough to support a fragile economy and a debt-ridden government, or keep it tight enough to convince people not to flee the currency entirely. It's an unsustainable position, and it's a hallmark of a system that is reaching its absolute limits. The prior big debt crisis recedes, a new equilibrium is reached, and a new cycle can begin. Stages 7 to 9. All right, so we've followed the crisis to its most intense point. The government is broke, the central bank has been printing money like there's no tomorrow, and the currency is in a death spiral. So, how does this story finally end? This is where we hit the last 3 stages of the cycle, where the system finally bottoms out and resets. Stage 7. debts are restructured and devalued. The goal here is what the author terms a beautiful deleveraging. Think of it like trying to land a jumbo jet in a storm. A crash landing is deflation, a painful, grinding halt to the economy. But you also can't just fire up the engines and shoot for the moon, because that's hyperinflation. A beautiful deleveraging is that skillful landing right in the middle, where policymakers balance the inflationary tool of printing money with the deflationary tool of restructuring debts. But for the average person, this phase is brutal. The core of it is that the money in your pocket, your savings, starts losing its value fast. The author is very clear on this. The remaining holders of the currency and the debt take big losses in real terms. Your cash just doesn't buy what it used to. So, where does the smart money go? It flees to hard assets. We're talking about things you can touch, like gold and commodities, and also stocks in the companies that make and sell real things. On average, in these situations, gold outperforms holding cash by about 60%. Imagine that. While your savings are eroding, other assets are providing a critical shield. At the same time, the government is in a tough spot. Its first instinct is to defend the currency, selling off its reserves of gold and foreign currency to prop up the value. But eventually, the pressure is too much. It has to give in and start the printing presses, which is what leads to that inflation that helps devalue the mountain of debt. This leads us to a much shorter but very intense phase, Stage 8, the imposition of extraordinary policies. When the government is this strapped for cash, it gets desperate. This is when you see big tax hikes. We're talking about marginal income and inheritance taxes jumping significantly. At the same time, anyone with money is looking for the exits. They see higher taxes and a collapsing currency and try to move their wealth abroad. The government's response? Capital controls. They essentially lock the doors, making it incredibly difficult to move money out of the country. It's a classic sign that the economic pressure has become almost unbearable, but all this chaos and pain sets the stage for the final act, Stage 9, the return to equilibrium. The devaluation in Stage 7, as terrible as it is, has one positive side effect. It massively reduces the country's debt burden. Now, the nation has a chance to rebuild. The author lays out 5 classic steps that are almost always necessary to make this transition work. First, you have to formally restructure the debts to manageable levels. Second, the government has to go through a period of painful fiscal policy adjustment. That's a polite way of saying budget cuts and austerity. Third, the country has to rebuild its reserves to back the currency and prove it stable. Fourth, the central bank has to raise interest rates to very high levels, making it attractive for people to save and hold the currency again. And finally, you have to put new rules in place to limit the central bank from just printing money wildly in the future. It's an incredibly tough process. But once it's done, the country has a clean slate. This is often the point of maximum opportunity. With the debts cleared and stability restored, it can be one of the best times to invest in the country's future. The cycle has hit bottom, and a new one is ready to begin. The overall big cycle. This is where the author zooms out from just talking about debt and money and connects it to the bigger historical forces that are changing our world. He says that watching what's happening today is like watching a movie he's seen many times before, just with more modern technology and different clothes. His whole approach is built on finding these timeless and universal patterns that explain the big shifts in history. And he boils it all down to what he calls the overall big cycle, which is driven by 5 huge forces that all interact with each other. First up is the debt and money cycle, which we've already covered a lot. The main point to remember is that countries always create too much debt. It's a timeless story. This eventually leads to a crisis where people try to turn their financial assets back into real money and discover they can't. To avoid a total collapse, the central bank almost always steps in and prints a ton of money, which devalues the currency and the debt. When you see a country with huge debts, lots of conflict inside its borders, and lots of conflict with other countries, that's a huge red flag. It's the late stage of the cycle, right before things get really rocky. The second big force is the internal order and disorder cycle. This is about the political swings inside a country. We see short-term political fights all the time, but they add up to a much bigger, longer cycle of peace and conflict. The author explains how democracies can eventually fail and turn into autocracies. It's a pattern he traces all the way back to Plato. It typically happens when there are huge gaps in wealth and values, the economy is doing poorly, and the political system is too gridlocked to fix anything. The opposing sides stop compromising and become willing to fight to win at all costs. This is when a strong populist leader, a demagogue, as Plato called them, can rise to power by promising easy solutions and radical change. The book points to historical figures like Caesar, Napoleon, and Hitler as examples of this dynamic. Next is the international order and disorder cycle. This is about how countries deal with each other. For the same reasons you have peace and conflict inside a country, you have periods of peace and war between countries. The author argues that true global cooperation is actually really rare. It usually only happens right after a massive war, when everyone is sick of fighting and there's one dominant power strong enough to enforce the peace, like the United States did after World War II, when it set up the UN and the World Bank. But he says that era is fading fast. We are now swinging back toward what he calls unilateralism, a more self-interested dog-eat-dog world where powerful countries do what they want and alliances can shift on a dime. It's a world where, as he puts it, the strong prey on the weak. The fourth force is something we're all becoming more familiar with: acts of nature. This includes droughts, floods, and pandemics. Throughout history, these events have often been more destructive than wars. He argues that these problems are getting worse and more expensive, and they don't happen in a bubble. They create migration pressure, strain government budgets that are already maxed out with debt, and add another layer of stress to the entire system. Finally, the fifth force is human inventiveness and technology. This is the engine of progress that has raised living standards for centuries. But technology is a double-edged sword. Examples like the railway boom in the 1800s and the dot-com bubble of the 90s, where amazing new technologies also fueled massive, speculative debt bubbles that ended in a crash. He identifies artificial intelligence as the next great technology that will dramatically change everything, for better or for worse. So you have these five massive forces: debt, internal politics, international relations, nature, and technology, all churning and influencing each other. The single most important factor, more important than any of the five forces, is simply how people deal with each other. If people and their leaders can find a way to work together through these challenges, they can achieve the best possible outcomes. But human nature hasn't changed much over the millennia, so cooperation is often the hardest part. From 1865 to 1945, in a tiny nutshell. Let's dial the clock back to 1865. The U.S. Civil War has just ended. The country is unified on paper, but it's also flat broke. To fund the war, the government had borrowed a staggering amount of money in printed cash called greenbacks that wasn't backed by gold. As a result, the dollar's value tanked, and the nation was technically in default. This brings up a timeless principle the author points to. When debts get too big, governments are forced to break their promises. They print more money, restructure what they owe, and often stop people from trading in their paper money for hard money like gold. That's exactly what happened. But after the pain of war and default, America entered a period of incredible growth. From about 1870 to 1914, we had the Second Industrial Revolution. Think about the game changers that came out of this era: railroads stitching the country together, massive steel production for bridges and skyscrapers, the miracle of electricity, the light bulb, the telephone, and the first automobiles. It was an explosive period of innovation. Naturally, this created immense fortunes. Visionaries and tough-minded businessmen, later nicknamed robber barons, became fabulously wealthy. This period wasn't called the Gilded Age for nothing, but with great wealth came a great wealth gap, and that stirred up social and political conflict. On one side, you had the powerful capitalists, and on the other, you had the working class, increasingly drawn to socialist ideas. This whole boom was built on a shaky financial system. With no central bank to manage the flow of money, the economy was prone to brutal boom and bust cycles. There were devastating financial panics in 1873, 1893, and 1907. The busts were so bad that they sparked a huge political fight over the gold standard. The famous politician William Jennings Bryan captured the anger of ordinary people when he declared, "You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." Finally, after the panic of 1907 nearly brought the whole system down, the government stepped in and created the Federal Reserve in 1913, hoping to bring some stability. At the same time, the rest of the world was heating up. A rising Germany was challenging Great Britain's dominance in Europe, while Japan was becoming the major power in Asia. Then, in 1914, an assassination in Europe lit the fuse, and World War I began. The war completely reshaped the world. The old European powers, like Britain and France, were left exhausted and deeply in debt. The losers, like Germany and the Ottoman Empire, were devastated. But the United States, which entered the war late and profited by selling supplies to the Allies, came out on top. For the first time, America was the world's leading financial and economic power. So, the first cycle ends, and what happens next? The pattern repeats. The war ends in 1918, and we roll right into the Roaring Twenties. Just like after the Civil War, it was a time of peace, incredible creativity, and economic boom. We got mass-produced automobiles, airplanes, radios, and even talking movies. Life was changing fast, and it felt like the party would never end. But just like before, this party was fueled by massive amounts of debt and wild speculation in the stock market. We all know how that story ends. The stock market crash of 1929. The bubble burst, and the world plunged into the Great Depression. This economic collapse triggered that same timeless principle. President Franklin D. Roosevelt faced a massive debt crisis, and he made some radical moves. He effectively broke the government's promise again. In 1933, he made it illegal for Americans to privately own gold. He devalued the dollar by about 40%, and he stopped allowing people to exchange their paper money for gold. It was a desperate and necessary move to fight the Depression. This economic chaos created political chaos both at home and abroad. The fight between the hard left and the hard right intensified. In countries like Germany, Italy, Japan, and Spain, dysfunctional democracies gave way to autocratic fascist leaders who promised to restore order. These newly aggressive powers, led by strongmen, began to flex their muscles. Hitler defaulted on Germany's war debts. Germany and Japan became expansionist, seizing territory and challenging the old powers like Britain and France, who were too weak to defend their global empires. The world slid towards war once again. There was economic warfare, nations freezing each other's assets, and a massive military buildup. It all came to a head in 1939 in Europe and 1941 with the attack on Pearl Harbor. World War II was the violent, brutal culmination of this cycle. And by 1945, when the dust settled, the world order had been completely reset. The old cycle was over. The winners, led by the United States, met to design a new system, a new world order. This new order, born from the ashes of the old one, is the one we've been living in ever since. And that sets the stage for the next part of the story. A brief review of the big debt cycle from 1945 to now. If you look back, each decade was almost the polar opposite of the one that came before it. The inflationary 70s gave way to the disinflationary 80s. The roaring 90s led to the busts of the 2000s. And at the end of each decade, everyone just expected more of the same, which is usually when things were about to flip. The whole story is driven by a simple mechanic. When the economy is weak, the central bank stimulates it by lowering interest rates. This encourages people and companies to borrow more, which creates more spending and more debt. This goes on until interest rates can't be lowered anymore. They hit zero. At that point, to keep things from collapsing, the central bank has to switch to a different tool, printing money to buy up debt, especially government debt. This has happened twice in the last century, and we're living through the second episode right now. The book uses a series of really powerful charts to tell this story, and you don't need to be an economist to get the main idea. The first big visual is the handoff of debt between the private sector and the government. For decades after World War II, private debt just went up and up. Then in 2008, it hit a wall and started to come down. But the overall debt didn't disappear. Instead, the government stepped in and took on massive amounts of debt to save the system. The chart shows the government's debt line soaring right when the private sector's debt line dips. This is a classic sign that a country is entering the late stage of a big debt cycle. Then there's a chart that's genuinely shocking. It shows the U.S. government's total debt payments, that's principal plus interest, as a percentage of its annual tax revenue. For most of the last 70 years, it hovered in a manageable range. But now, it's around 100%, and the projections show it heading towards 150% in the coming years. Imagine that the amount of money you had to pay in debt service each year was 50% greater than what you earned each year. It's unthinkable. For this to work, the government has to successfully roll over all its old debt while borrowing trillions more, and hope that investors, both at home and abroad, don't get spooked and start selling. This is where the author dives into what he calls the most important number to watch in the financial world, the real bond yield. It sounds complicated, but the idea is simple. The interest rate you see on a government bond is made up of two things: the part that covers expected inflation and the real return you get on top of that. This real return is the true measure of how attractive it is to save or lend money. The book shows that for most of the last century, this real return has averaged about 2%. But there have been wild swings. When it's super low or negative, it's a terrible time to be a saver, but a fantastic time to be a borrower. When it's high, the opposite is true. These swings have driven the huge bubbles and busts of the cycle. And this brings us to the Fed's big actions. A chart in the book shows two huge spikes in money printing. The first was in the 1930s, after the Great Depression, when interest rates first hit zero. The second started in 2008 and got even bigger during the pandemic, the second time rates hit zero. It's the same playbook, decades apart. The author points out that the Fed is now taking losses the bonds it bought because interest rates have gone up. He calls this a red flag for the health of the central bank itself. This isn't just an American story. It shows charts for all the major developed countries, the G7, China, the UK, France, and they all show the same thing. Government debt is on a path to grow substantially for decades to come. It's a global phenomenon, the result of a cycle that has been building for over 75 years and is now entering its most challenging and uncertain phase. 1945 to 1971. A linked monetary system. In 1945, World War II is over, and the winning powers, led by the United States, get together to design a new financial system for the world. They meet in a small town in New Hampshire called Bretton Woods, and what they create there governs the global economy for the next 27 years. So, what was this system? At its core, it was what's called a hard monetary system. The U.S. dollar was linked directly to gold at a fixed price. Think of it this way. The dollar was like a claimed check, and you could, in theory, turn it in and get a specific amount of real gold. Other countries then pegged their currencies to the dollar. This was supposed to create stability. The author points out the built-in flaw in this kind of system. Governments always end up printing more claim checks, more paper money, than they have gold in the vault. Eventually, people figure this out, and you get a run on the bank, where everyone rushes to get the real stuff before it's gone. In the aftermath of the war, the world was a very different place. The United States was the undisputed heavyweight champion. It had something like 2/3 of the world's gold and produced about half of everything made in the world. This allowed the U.S. to do things like fund the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe. The main geopolitical drama was, of course, the Cold War between the capitalist U.S. and the communist Soviet Union. Meanwhile, the book uses the British Empire as a classic cautionary tale. The U.K. came out of the war with huge debts and an empire it could no longer afford. It went through a series of painful currency devaluations, a perfect example of what happens to a great power when its finances crumble. At the same time, you had these other seeds being planted that would grow into huge deals later on. China was just emerging from what it calls its century of humiliation, and scientists were quietly laying the groundwork for things like artificial intelligence and the internet. For a while, the system worked, but by the 1960s, the cracks began to show. The United States started spending a ton of money. It was fighting the Vietnam War abroad and funding big war on poverty social programs at home. To pay for all this, it just printed more dollars. Other countries, especially a recovering Germany and Japan, were becoming economic powerhouses. They were selling a lot of stuff to the U.S. and accumulating huge piles of these dollars, and they started to get nervous. They looked at how much the U.S. was spending and realized there was no way America had enough gold to back all the dollars it was printing. So they started calling the bluff. Countries, led by France, began showing up with their dollars and asking for gold in return, as the agreement allowed, and you could see the U.S. gold reserves steadily draining away. The author shares a personal story from this time about the Cuban Missile Crisis. He was young and expected the stock market to crash with the threat of nuclear war, but it barely budged. He says it taught him a valuable lesson. Big, scary headlines don't really move markets unless they start to mess with the actual flow of money. The slow, steady drain of gold from U.S. vaults was a much bigger deal for the financial system than the threat of missiles. This all came to a head on a Sunday night in August 1971. President Richard Nixon went on TV and announced that the United States was officially closing the gold window. The U.S. would no longer exchange dollars for gold. Period. The system was over. The author says he was a young clerk on the New York Stock Exchange at the time and was sure this meant a stock market crash was coming. The next day, stocks had their biggest rally of the year. He was stunned. This shock led him to study history, where he discovered that President Roosevelt had done the exact same thing back in 1933 for the exact same reasons. And this is where he learned a crucial lesson that defines the whole book. When a country's debt problems become too painful to handle, the central bank will always choose to print money. This devalues the currency, which is bad for savers, but it makes the debt easier to pay and often sends asset prices like stocks and gold soaring. The collapse of Bretton Woods wasn't just a historical event, it was a perfect real-world demonstration of how the debt cycle machine works. 1971 to 2008, a fiat money, interest rate-driven monetary policy. When President Nixon closed the gold window in 1971, he didn't just end a monetary system. He kicked off a whole new era. The author calls this next phase Monetary Policy 1. In simple terms, the world moved from hard money backed by gold to fiat money, which is backed by nothing but faith in the government that issues it. This meant the Federal Reserve was now free to print as much money as it wanted, with its main tool for controlling the economy being the raising or lowering of interest rates. This new, unrestrained system kicked off with a decade of something economists called stagflation, a toxic mix of a stagnant economy and high inflation. That first decade, from 1971 to 1982, was a wild ride. With the dollar no longer tied to gold, the floodgates opened. In 10 years, the money supply doubled. Prices went up 140%, and gold went up by 10 times. It was a fantastic time to be a debtor because you could pay back your loans with cheaper and cheaper dollars. But it was a nightmare for savers and creditors. Bondholders got absolutely crushed, losing about 40% of their buying power. This easy money environment was supercharged by geopolitical events. The 1973 oil shock hit, and then a second one followed the Iranian Revolution in 1979. This sent inflation into the stratosphere. By the end of the decade, Americans were fed up with soaring prices, a weak economy, and a sense of national decline. This led to a massive political and economic shift. Paul Volcker was appointed to run the Federal Reserve, and he did the unthinkable. He jacked up interest rates to historically high levels to break the back of inflation. At the same time, you had the election of conservative leaders like Ronald Reagan in the U.S. and Margaret Thatcher in the U.K., who came in with a mandate to get things under control. This set the stage for the 1980s, a decade that the author describes as the complete opposite of the 1970s. The Volcker-Reagan policies worked. Inflation came crashing down, and with it, interest rates began a long 30-year decline. It was a fantastic environment for stocks and bonds in the developed world, a capitalist's dream. But there was a flip side. The high interest rate, strong dollar policy created a massive debt crisis in the developing world. Countries in Latin America and elsewhere had borrowed tons of U.S. dollars in the 70s when the dollar was weak. Now, they had to pay those loans back with a dollar that was incredibly strong, and it crushed them, leading to a lost decade of economic depression. Meanwhile, the geopolitical landscape was being redrawn. The Soviet Union, unable to keep up financially, began its terminal decline. And in China, a leader named Deng Xiaoping started opening the country up to market forces, kicking off its historic economic transformation. The 1990s were the decade of globalization and the dot-com bubble. With the Soviet Union gone, the world felt more interconnected than ever. The Internet went from a niche academic project to a global phenomenon. This unleashed a wave of investment and speculation into anything with a .com at the end of its name. A massive bubble formed between 1995 and 1999. This boom and bust cycle wasn't just in the U.S. The cheap money sloshing around the world also fueled a debt bubble in Asia, which burst spectacularly in the 1997 Asian financial crisis. Over in Europe, leaders were trying to compete in this new globalized world by creating a single currency. And in 1999, the euro was born. This brings us to the final chapter of this era from 2000 to 2008. The story is one of a bubble bursting, only to create an even bigger, more dangerous one. The Fed, worried about the dot-com speculation, had started raising interest rates. In March of 2000, the bubble popped and tech stocks crashed. The economy tipped into a recession, which was then made much worse by the 9/11 attacks. In response, the Fed did what it always does. It cut interest rates aggressively. This flood of cheap money had to go somewhere, and it went right into the housing market. A new massive bubble in real estate and complex mortgages began to inflate. This was the final frantic party of the era, and in 2008, that bubble popped, triggering the global financial crisis. The entire system came to the brink of collapse, and the Fed was forced to cut interest rates all the way to zero. This moment marked the definitive end of the interest rate-driven monetary era and the beginning of something entirely new. 2008 to 2020, fiat money and debt monetization. The global financial crisis of 2008 wasn't just another recession. It was a massive deleveraging, a once-in-a-generation event that changed everything. The author breaks this period down as the next major phase of the big debt cycle, where the old rules of money stopped working and a new, more radical playbook was introduced. It all started when the massive housing and mortgage bubble popped and the crisis spread like wildfire. It took down banks, companies, and regular people across the globe. By late 2008, the Federal Reserve had hit a wall. It had cut interest rates all the way to zero, and it couldn't go any lower. This is when the Fed shifted to what the author calls Monetary Policy 2, but what most of us know as quantitative easing, or QE. In simple terms, QE is debt monetization. The central bank starts printing money and uses it to buy massive quantities of government bonds and other assets. This had not been done on a large scale since the Great Depression in the 1930s. The goal was to inject cash into the financial system, push down long-term interest rates, and prevent a total collapse. It worked, in a sense. Financial markets recovered, but this policy had a huge side effect. Since QE pumps up the value of assets like stocks and real estate, it massively benefited the wealthy who owned those assets, while many regular people were still struggling. This brings us to the political fallout. The 2008 crisis and the subsequent government bailouts of big banks created a deep sense of anger and injustice across the country. There was a powerful feeling that the system was rigged, that Wall Street got bailed out, while Main Street got sold out. This anger fueled a huge surge in populism on both sides of the aisle. On the right, you had the rise of the Tea Party movement. On the left, you had the Occupy Wall Street protests. This growing divide, fueled by wealth gaps and a loss of faith in institutions, led directly to the political earthquake of 2016 and the election of Donald Trump. His presidency is described as a major turning point, ushering in an era of more aggressive, nationalistic policies that reshaped America's role in the world. Now, to understand what makes the U.S. situation unique, the book uses the European debt crisis as a powerful case study. It asks, what happens when a country has a massive debt crisis but can't print its own money to get out of it? That was the story for Greece. After joining the euro, Greece was able to borrow a ton of money very cheaply. A huge debt bubble formed. When the 2008 crisis hit, that bubble burst, and Greece was in deep trouble. But unlike the U.S., Greece couldn't just print euros to solve its problem. It was forced to go down a much more painful path of austerity, slashing government spending, which only made its economic depression worse. Interest rates on its debt spiked to over 70%. Ultimately, the European Central Bank and the IMF had to step in with a massive bailout and a forced debt restructuring. It was an incredibly painful, drawn-out process that took years to recover from. The story of Greece is a stark reminder of the ugly side of a deleveraging when the money-printing option isn't on the table. Of course, other big things were happening during this decade. Geopolitical tensions began to rise, particularly between the U.S. and a rising China, in a way that felt similar to the lead-up to past great power conflicts. Climate change became a much more urgent topic, and technology continued its relentless march forward with the explosion of smartphones, social media, streaming services, and the early days of AI and cryptocurrencies changing almost every aspect of our lives. It was a decade of crisis, change, and rising conflict, setting the stage for the even more turbulent times that would follow. Since 2020, pandemic and big fiscal deficits monetized. The year 2020 changed everything. The COVID-19 pandemic wasn't just a health crisis, it triggered a complete shift in how governments and central banks manage the economy. This kicked off a brand new phase of the debt cycle, something the author calls Monetary Policy 3, or MP3. So what is MP3? It's basically when the central government and the central bank throw the old rulebook out the window and start working together directly. The government starts spending massive amounts of money, sending checks directly to people and businesses, and the central bank fires up the printing presses to buy all the debt the government is issuing. This happens when just cutting interest rates or even doing quantitative easing isn't enough anymore, especially when you need to get money into the hands of people who are really struggling. Not just propping up the financial system, it was a radical step born out of a radical crisis. The book uses a few updated charts to put the last few years in perspective. You can see government debt levels, which were already high, just go vertical after 2020. At the same time, the government's debt service, the amount it has to pay each year, is projected to hit dangerously high levels. Other charts show the Federal Reserve's balance sheet exploding as it printed trillions to monetize all that new debt. And then you see the consequence. The Fed itself started taking huge losses on all those bonds when it later had to raise interest rates. It's a series of visuals that shows a system being pushed to its absolute limits. The core of the story is the incredibly fast economic cycle we just lived through. It happened in a few distinct acts. First, you had the easing in 2020 and 2021. In response to the pandemic lockdown, The government unleashed trillions in stimulus. This, combined with the Fed's money printing, created what the author calls an orgy of borrowing and fueled huge speculative bubbles in things like tech stocks and crypto. Then came the inevitable hangover, the inflation surge, all that new money chasing a limited supply of goods, made worse by broken supply chains, caused inflation to spike to levels not seen in 40 years. This forced the Fed to slam on the brakes. The tightening phase in 2022 and 2023 saw the most aggressive interest rate hikes in decades. This move popped the speculative bubbles, crushed the stock and bond markets, and made the U.S. dollar incredibly strong. Finally, we have the aftermath. Inflation started to cool down, but prices for everyday things remained painfully high. The book, written from the perspective of early 2025, describes how this economic whiplash intensified the political divisions in the U.S., becoming a major factor in the 2024 election and leading to a significant political shift. The author connects these recent events to his 5 big forces that shape history, and the picture is pretty sobering. Government debt is at record levels and growing. Internal conflict between the political right and left is more intense than ever. International conflict, especially between the U.S. and China, is heating up. Acts of nature, like climate change, are becoming more frequent and costly. And technology, particularly AI, is on the verge of disrupting everything. All 5 of these massive forces moving in a dangerous direction at the same time is incredibly rare. You have to go back to the 1930s to find a similar period, a historical parallel that is both fascinating and deeply concerning. China's big cycle from 1945 to 49 until now, in a tiny nutshell. To really understand what's going on with China today, you have to understand its history, and not just the last few years, but the last few centuries. And for China, the most important part of its recent history is what it calls the Century of Humiliation. From roughly the 1840s to the 1940s, China was carved up, exploited, and humiliated by foreign powers. This experience is burned into the psyche of its leaders today. It explains their intense focus on building economic and military strength to ensure that never happens again. It also explains why they view the current dynamic with the United States as another chapter in a long history of fending off foreign pressure. This history is the backdrop for what the author calls the classic great power conflict we're seeing play out right now. After the Communist Party won the Civil War in 1949, China entered the Mao era. For almost 30 years, the country was run by Mao Zedong. It was a period of rigid communist control, economic stagnation, and almost complete isolation from the rest of the world. But a funny thing happened in the 1970s. China and the United States, despite being ideological enemies, found a common enemy they feared even more, the Soviet Union. This shared threat led to the shocking and historic diplomatic opening, with President Nixon visiting China and changing the course of the Cold War. After Mao died, the next huge chapter in China's story began, the Deng era. Starting in 1978, a new leader, Deng Xiaoping, changed everything. He famously said, "It doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white as long as it catches mice." What he meant was that it didn't matter if an economic policy was communist or capitalist, as long as it made the country rich. He opened China's doors to foreign investment and introduced market-style reforms. This unleashed the most explosive economic transformation in human history. China became the world's factory, leveraging its massive low-cost workforce to produce goods for the entire planet. Hundreds of millions of people were lifted out of poverty. But this incredible rise had a side effect. It was fueled by a massive buildup of debt, and it created huge gaps between the rich and the poor. It was a classic economic boom with all the benefits and all the hidden risks that come with it. This brings us to the current era under Xi Jinping, which began in 2012. This period has been defined by three things: consolidating political power, a major debt crisis, and escalating conflict with the United States. Initially, Xi focused on things like fighting corruption, but over time, the direction shifted. The U.S.-China conflict started to get serious around 2017, moving from a trade war to a full-blown rivalry over technology and global influence. Then, in 2021, the bill for China's long economic party came due. Its massive real estate and debt bubble finally burst. This triggered a difficult and ongoing deleveraging process. In response to these internal and external pressures, the leadership has moved away from the free market focus of the Deng era and has reasserted more traditional, centralized Communist Party control over the economy and society. So, where does that leave China today? The book analyzes its current situation using that five-force framework. The debt and economic situation is precarious. China is in the middle of a major debt crisis, very similar to where Japan was in the 1990s. To manage internal conflict, the government has tightened its political grip. In terms of external conflict, it's locked in a great power struggle with the U.S. As for acts of nature, it's dealing with the effects of climate change while also, paradoxically, becoming a world leader in green technology. And finally, in technology, it's fighting a high-stakes tech war with America, where it's both falling behind in some areas, like advanced computer chips, and leaping ahead in others, like robotics and AI applications. It's a country grappling with all five of these massive forces hitting at the same time, which makes its future and ours incredibly uncertain. The Japanese case and the lessons it provides. For anyone interested in how economies work, Japan is one of the most fascinating and important case studies in the world. Its story over the last 30 years is a masterclass in what can happen when a country with a massive amount of debt tries to manage the fallout. The author uses Japan's experience to provide some critical lessons for what other countries, including the U.S., might be facing down the road. First, a little history. Like many countries, Japan's modern story was forged by its interactions with the West. In the 1850s, American warships forced Japan to open up to trade, which led to a period of incredibly rapid modernization. But in the 1920s and 30s, as the global economy soured, Japan followed a path we've seen before. Economic trouble led to a rise in nationalism and militarism. This ended, of course, with its defeat in World War II, which completely wiped out its old system and set the stage for a new beginning. After the war, Japan's economy was a miracle. It rebuilt and became an industrial titan. But this boom was fueled by a massive debt bubble, which popped in a huge way around 1990. And what happened next is the core of the story. For more than 20 years, Japan did the exact opposite, as the author puts it, of what it should have done to clean up the mess. Instead of forcing banks to deal with their bad loans, they let them linger for years, creating zombie institutions that couldn't lend or function properly. Instead of stimulating the economy by printing money and making it easier to pay off debts, they kept policy too tight. The result was 2 lost decades of economic stagnation and deflation, a long, grinding depression that sapped the country's economic vitality. This all changed dramatically around 2013 with the arrival of a new prime minister, Shinzo Abe. His radical new policy, nicknamed Abenomics, was a complete reversal. This is the most important part of the story. The Bank of Japan went all in on a policy of massive debt monetization. It started printing trillions of yen and buying up enormous amounts of government debt. This had a few huge effects. First, it pushed interest rates to extremely low, often negative levels. Second, and most importantly, it caused a massive devaluation of the Japanese yen. For anyone holding Japanese bonds or currency, it was a disaster. From 2013 on, holding Japanese government bonds lost you 45% compared to holding U.S. bonds, and a staggering 60% compared to holding gold. But this weak currency made Japan incredibly competitive. Suddenly, Japanese labor and Japanese products were much cheaper on the world stage. The average Japanese worker's salary, while stable in yen, has plummeted in U.S. dollar terms. This created a weird 2-tiered economy. For things produced in Japan like housing and local services, prices stayed flat, shielding the population from the worst of the pain. But for anything imported, from food to oil to iPhones, prices soared. So, who were the winners and losers in this great experiment? The winners were clearly the Japanese government and Japanese corporations. The government, despite having the highest debt in the world, saw its interest payments fall dramatically because its own central bank was buying up the debt. And corporations became much more competitive globally. The losers were just as clear. Anyone who saved in yen or held Japanese government bonds saw the value of their holdings get destroyed in global terms. And the Bank of Japan itself is now sitting on a balance sheet that is a potential time bomb. It owns a huge portion of the country's debt, and if interest rates ever rise to normal levels, it would face astronomical losses. The author concludes by boiling this all down to 5 key dynamics. First, the government ran huge deficits to pump cash into the private sector. Second, the central bank printed money to finance it all. Third, the currency crashed, acting as a stealth tax on anyone holding yen. Fourth, domestic savers were also taxed through this devaluation, though not as badly. And fifth, the whole country became more competitive as a result. It's a remarkable story of how a country can manage an enormous debt load, but at a very steep price. What my indicators show. After looking at all these historical cycles, the author lays out this dashboard of indicators to assess the risk of a government debt crisis. First, he shows this big table with countries like the U.S., Japan, China, and others, comparing them on a few key metrics. It's a quick snapshot. You see that Japan has a mind-boggling amount of government debt, but most of it is held internally. China has a lot of debt too, but its currency isn't the world's go-to money, which is a vulnerability. And then there's the United States. The dashboard shows the U.S. has very large government debts and not a lot of savings or reserves to back them up. But it has one giant advantage that changes everything. The U.S. dollar is the world's dominant reserve currency. This status is the main thing mitigating the risk, and America's financial well-being hinges on keeping it that way. Then, the author presents these two risk gauges for the U.S. government's debt. He makes a crucial distinction between long-term risk and short-term risk. The short-term risk gauge, which measures the imminent danger of a crisis, is currently at 0. Basically, things are okay for now. The economy is growing, inflation is moderate, and there's no immediate panic. But the long-term risk gauge is at 100%, the highest it can be. The author says the U.S. government's debt situation is nearing the point of no return. Why the difference? Because the sheer amount of debt the U.S. has and the amount it needs to borrow every year just to keep the lights on is at an unprecedented level. He warns that this creates the risk of a death spiral down the road if investors ever start to doubt America's ability to pay its bills. The contrast is stark. No danger today, but extreme danger on the horizon. Next, the analysis applies the same framework to the Federal Reserve itself. How healthy is the country's central bank? Again, the short-term risk is basically 0. The Fed isn't in any immediate trouble, but the long-term risk gauge is sitting at 46%, which is moderately high. This is because the Fed bought trillions of dollars of government bonds and is now sitting on huge paper losses on that portfolio now that interest rates have gone up. The author says to watch for 2 big red flags in the future. The first would be another big round of quantitative easing, more money printing. The second, and perhaps more dangerous, would be the government taking political control over the Fed and stripping it of its independence. So, what holds it all together for the U.S.? The dollar, the fact that the whole world uses dollars for trade and holds them in reserve, gives the U.S. an incredible advantage that offsets a lot of these terrible-looking numbers. But all of this analysis, the dashboards, the risk gauges, is only looking at the financial picture. It doesn't even factor in the other huge forces at play, the intense internal political conflict, the rising international conflict, the costs of climate change, and the disruptions from new technology. Those forces, he says, will also have a massive impact on this already fragile financial situation. My 3% three-part solution. After laying out the sheer scale of the U.S. debt problem, it actually proposes a clear, actionable plan to fix it. The author calls it the 3% three-part solution. Here's the gist. The goal is to cut the annual U.S. budget deficit down to a manageable 3% of our economy's size, or GDP. Right now, it's projected to be about double that. The plan says we can get there by pulling a combination of three main levers. 1. Cut government spending. 2. Increase taxes. And 3. Reduce interest rates. The author argues that instead of getting bogged down in endless arguments about specific cuts, policymakers should agree on the 3% target first, and then work out the details. The book analyzes the power of these three levers, and it comes to a striking conclusion. The single most powerful tool for reducing the national debt isn't cutting spending or raising taxes. It's getting the Federal Reserve to lower interest rates. A 1% cut in interest rates has about 4 times the long-term impact on the debt than a 1% increase in tax revenue. This leads to the core of the proposal. The ideal policy is a grand bargain that combines fiscal tightening with monetary easing. In plain English, that means Congress would make some tough choices to cut spending and raise taxes, and at the same time, the Federal Reserve would lower interest rates to stimulate the economy. The two moves would essentially cancel each other out in terms of their effect on economic growth. The budget cuts would slow things down, but the lower interest rates would speed things up, leaving the economy stable while the deficit comes down. Of course, there's the political reality. The Federal Reserve is independent and can't just make a backroom deal with Congress. The author acknowledges this, but makes a clever point. If Congress actually passed a serious deficit reduction plan, the bond market would likely rally on the good news, and interest rates would fall naturally. And if the budget cuts did start to slow down the economy too much, the Fed's job is to step in and lower rates anyway. So, the partnership doesn't have to be explicit to work. The book also shows that this isn't some fantasy. It presents data from other countries that have made huge cuts to their deficits. The ones that succeeded, the painless cases, all did it when their economies were strong and when they paired the budget cuts with easier monetary policy. The most successful example in our own history was in the 1990s, when the U.S. went from a large deficit to a budget surplus, without derailing the economy. So, where would the savings come from? We don't need to reinvent the wheel. He uses a menu of options, mostly from the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, to show that the 3% target is achievable through a series of moderate and targeted changes. We're not talking about eliminating Social Security. We're talking about things like phasing in a slightly higher retirement age over many years, or closing specific tax deductions for high earners. The book breaks down the federal budget to show where the money is going, making it clear that a grand bargain is possible if our leaders can compromise. Do it now. The author argues that the best time to fix your roof is when the sun is shining. Right now, the U.S. economy is relatively strong and can handle these kinds of adjustments. If we wait until the next crisis hits, when the economy is weak, it will be infinitely more painful. The solutions are there. They are workable. The only thing standing in the way is political gridlock. What the future looks like to me. Most people think the future is unknowable, but the author sees it as mostly predestined, not by some mystical force, but by clear cause and effect relationships. He says his whole career has been about building models, now using forms of AI, to understand this giant machine of history and to bet against big, unsustainable situations that are bound to break. He gives a snapshot of where he thinks we are right now as of early 2025. The picture is pretty stark. The current world order, which began in 1945, is in stage 5 of its life cycle, about 90 to 95% of the way through. This is the stage right before, in his words, great conflicts and seismic shifts. He argues that the current mix of massive debt, internal political division, and international tension is most similar to the 1930s. He also says we're at a moment of maximum uncertainty because the new U.S. administration is seen as more radical and unpredictable than any in modern history. First is the debt and money force. The conclusion here is that the U.S. and other major powers are so deep in debt that there's a very high probability, something like 80% over the next 10 years, of a major debt crisis. This wouldn't be a normal recession. It would force a restructuring or monetization of debt, potentially through radical, once unthinkable actions like freezing debt payments, seizing assets of enemy nations, or even creating new types of money. Second is the domestic order and disorder force. This focuses on the intense political polarization in the United States. The author presents charts showing the gap between the two parties is wider than ever. He predicts that this dysfunction will lead to more autocratic-style leadership, because when compromise fails, power is the only thing that matters. This means more power struggles between the president and the other branches of government. Third is the international order and disorder force. The era of global cooperation is over. We're now in a classic great power conflict between the United States and China. The author predicts that in this new, more confrontational world, alliances will shift quickly and unexpectedly. Old friends could become rivals, and old rivals could become allies. The fourth force is acts of nature. The costs of climate change and future pandemics are a massive, growing, and underfunded headwind that will strain national budgets even further. And the fifth force is technology. This is the one bright spot. The author sees the current AI revolution as a force that will have a massive impact on productivity. But it's also a double-edged sword, fueling a high-stakes economic and military competition, especially between the U.S. and China. So, how does this all affect the markets? The book tackles the popular narrative of American exceptionalism, the idea that American innovation and technology will keep driving everything higher. The author agrees that the U.S. has incredible strengths, but he argues that all this optimism is already baked into today's high asset prices. It ignores the huge risks coming from the massive debt problem and the intense political conflict. As powerful as the new wave of technology is, the author predicts that in the short term, it probably won't be enough to overcome the headwinds from the other four negative forces. The next 5 to 10 years, he says, will be a period of enormous changes, like going through a time warp into a totally different reality. The most important force of all is simply how people choose to deal with each other. If leaders can cooperate, the worst outcomes can be avoided. But if the current path of fighting to win at all costs continues, the road ahead looks incredibly rocky.